In a previous video, I told you all the reasons why Australians do not have a right to self-defense. Well, I'm here to tell you all the reasons why we also don't have a right to freedom of speech. You know, because our government hates us. Australia doesn't have holistic freedom of speech, and when I say that, I'm not doing so to be inflammatory. It's kind of just a fact. Part of the problem is that the laws that protect freedom of speech in Australia are incredibly flimsy and leave a lot of room for governments to come in and whittle away at those rights. More worrying still is that with freedom of speech and freedom of expression hanging by such a tenuous thread, it really only takes one swift swoop from the government to jump in and snap it. Something that kind of disturbs me a little bit about Australians, and I'm sure for a lot of people out there, is that they put an awful lot of trust and respect in their governments. And really, they don't think a lot of these things are an issue. I mean, you say that, and then one day, boom, you're Venezuela, and there's a dictator, and there's no food, and you're just eating out of the garbage. I mean, it sounds harsh, but no one's disagreeing. So first things first, and let me be clear. Unlike the United States, which has a Bill of Rights and a First Amendment that protects freedom of speech for its citizens, Australia has neither. Australia does not have a First Amendment equivalent enshrining freedom of speech in our Constitution, or anywhere for that matter. In fact, the only social freedom you actually have is the freedom of religion. Besides that, Australia has only 4 other enshrined rights in our Constitution, and they are the right to vote, Section 41, protection against acquisition of property on unjust terms, Section 51, the right to a trial by jury, Section 80, and the prohibition of discrimination on the basis of state of residency, Section 117. I mean, yeah, we're off to a really great start. I love all 5 of my rights. Pretty good. I think this is a really clear winner here. Yep. Now, the only real way that Australians have come to have a form of freedom of speech came from a High Court ruling in the 1990s. Before that, there were numerous restrictions and limitations enshrined in legislation. A High Court case in 1992 determined that political speech is protected from prosecution because freedom of speech is implied in our Constitution. This means that while freedom of speech is not explicitly stated in our Constitution, the High Court decided that in order for our democratic society to operate properly, freedom of political speech is a necessity. In short, this means that if you criticize the government, nobody's coming to arrest you. That is until we become Venezuela. And then you're eating from the garbage. However, this ruling does not mean that Australians have an overarching freedom of speech that can be applied to any topic at any time. The High Court of Australia subsequently ruled that this implied freedom is only protected against laws that infringe upon political speech. Again, and just to explain, this means that we cannot say what we want, when we want, whenever we want to about anything we want to say it about. It just means that when it comes to political and governmental affairs, we do actually get to say our thoughts. In this context, it's also important to know that we're talking about common law and statute law. Common law is often referred to as judge-made law. So in this context, the High Court ruling of freedom of speech is a common law. Statute laws, on the other hand, are those passed in legislation by the government, usually after they've interpreted the Constitution. I say interpreted lightly. It is lightly interpreted. The thing to remember is that common law can be expanded upon or limited by legislation passed by the government, or statute laws. To put this in context, just because the High Court of Australia decided that Australians have the right to political freedom of speech doesn't stop the government from passing legislation that impedes or builds upon that existing freedom of speech. I'm feeling a little bit sore about the fact that the government at any point can decide to take away freedoms that the High Court decided that we have. I mean, it's not cool. This is basically like legal purgatory. It's not cool. And before you know it, we'll be Venezuela, and everyone will be eating out of the garbage. One last example about this. So let's say that the common law says that you can say whatever you want, whenever you want about anything and not be charged. Then a statute law comes in that says that if you say anything or print anything that incites violence or says a particular thing about a particular person, you can be charged. Well, the statute law then overrides the common law and you will be charged. Now, in theory, governments in Australia cannot legislate to restrict or limit freedom of speech in this country. However, there are always exceptions. Anti-discrimination laws, such as the Racial Discrimination Act, for example, protect people against discrimination. However, they also restrict free speech by saying it is unlawful to offend or humiliate another person based on their race, disability, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. On the surface, these laws seem okay because they're a protection mechanism. Well, not so much. I mean, when you consider the fact that they're using terminology like humiliate or offend, which to me are pretty subjective terms and incredibly hard to monitor, you run into some trouble. In fact, telling people that being offended can land someone else in prison is pretty stupid. I mean, the other thing, and on a serious note, is how long is it before you're gonna go to prison for criticizing, I don't know, fat people and calling them a fat fuck? The other thing is that I really don't see a situation where this kind of legislation will ever apply to Caucasians. For instance, people are horrible to white people all the time, and there really doesn't ever seem to be any repercussions. Australia also has laws that prohibit swearing in public, which can be found in the Summary Offences Act of 1988. Australia also has laws that make it a crime to incite hostility towards particular religious groups. In Victoria and New South Wales in particular, there's legislation that says a person cannot engage in conduct that incites hatred against, serious contempt for, or revulsion or severe ridicule of that person or a class of persons of a particular religious group. Again, on the surface, these laws seem pretty reasonable, but the issue is that religions are and will continue to be a set of ideologies. Prohibiting people from criticizing religious ideas really only signals the end of freedom of speech, and if I'm totally honest, it's pretty absurd. And again, just like the racial discrimination laws that say things like offend and humiliate, you have terminology here that says severe ridicule or serious contempt, which again, to me, pretty subjective, pretty hard to monitor, probably not that good to put into legislation. Just saying. Unfortunately, people and religions go hand in hand. They are effectively one and the same at the end of the day. So for example, if a person is criticizing Christianity or Islam, it's really not that big of a leap to look at that in terms of Christians and Muslims. And therein lies the problem, and for someone like me, this is where these laws become dangerous, because realistically, you can't criticize a religion and say things that are negative about a religion without it impacting its followers. They're like connected, you know, it's like a thing. Now this brings me to another set of laws that make me deeply uncomfortable, and those are Australia's anti-terrorism laws. Basically, the anti-terrorism laws in Australia say that people can be held for an allotted period of time without charge, which is kind of expected. The other thing is that once they are released and they go about their merry lives, they can never talk about their experiences. You think the secrets you keep from your loved ones and family about the weird things you do on the weekend is legit? This is legit. The other thing is that, in relation to these laws, if a journalist uncovers anything relating to a person who'd been held on these terrorism suspicions, if that journalist puts that information out in the public, even unwittingly, even if they don't mean to do it, then they also are in big trouble. In the same vein, in 2014, federal legislation was passed giving the Attorney General new powers to declare operations special intelligence operations. This included events that had already passed, and once an operation was labeled as such, it prevents journalists from reporting on them. As part of this law, things the government might be doing illegally or dishonestly also cannot be reported on by journalists. In the same year, in 2014, the Tasmanian government passed new anti-protest laws. These laws prohibit protests on private or public spaces that impede businesses and the functioning of a business. In 2016, the New South Wales and Western Australian governments put in motion legislation that would mimic these anti-protest laws. In the same year, the Western Australian government also passed legislation that gave more power to police when it comes to protests. Now, I know a lot of people will watch this and they'll be like, Sydney, you crazy. Sydney, you hate the government. You hate the legal system. And look, you're not far from the truth. But I think the thing is that there are wider implications when it comes to this kind of legislation and it comes to the powers that the government has over what you can and can't do. For me, and for I know a lot of other people, this just signals the chipping away of our freedoms. And due to the fact that freedom of speech in particular is not enshrined anywhere in legislation, it's not in the Constitution, we don't have a Bill of Rights, really, like I said at the start, this leaves a big gaping hole for the government to step in and legislate your freedoms away. And I mean, truth be told, that really shouldn't sit well with anyone. Something else that disturbs me about all of this is that there are numerous academics and numerous people in Parliament that think that it's perfectly acceptable that Australians don't have an overarching freedom of speech. People like to make the argument that freedom of speech really should just be for discussion and criticism rather than actually causing harm to people. What I would point out is that you have an education system now that's teaching people that words are violent, and also we have victims everywhere and victimhood mentality permeates. So really, it's unsurprising that we do do have legislation that, talks about offending people and humiliating them, because most people just don't have a backbone. Now, to cap this off, while the United Nations, which I hate and should really just go the way of the dinosaurs, does actually have a treaty that talks about human rights, freedom of speech, and freedom of opinion. This actually says, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. But it's also worth noting that Australia has absolutely no obligation to uphold this statement. The thing to remember is that if Australia was to completely ignore this and to legislate, restrict, and impede upon freedom of speech and our human rights, there is very little that anybody else in the world can do about it besides being a little upset. In the same way that Australia received condemnation from the United Nations because of our treatment of asylum seekers, if Australia really wanted to disregard freedom of speech and stomp all over it in this country, there's really no tangible repercussions on a global scale. Super comforting. So comforting. So long as Australia doesn't have any enshrined freedom of speech that must be upheld by governments and politicians and so on, we really are consistently at a disadvantage. To my mind, the more emphasis that governments and special interest groups place on minorities, protecting those minorities, themselves, and protecting their own interests, the more and more that our rights are going to be whittled away. The more that you have politicians and diplomats and anybody else forcing acceptance upon you of anything, any idea, any person, any ideology, the more that your freedom of speech will be eroded. Now, here's the problem with the kind of legislation that Australia has and why we don't have any unalienable rights. You might think it's fine now, and it might very well be fine now. But what happens when more legislation like this is passed? More intrusive legislation, more restrictive legislation. What happens when an elected government body takes advantage of all the bills and laws and restrictions that we have, and all the restrictions that have been placed on the Australian people in terms of freedom of speech? Then what? When Australia's free speech is being hijacked by politicians and by laws that seek to force cohesion rather than allow people to speak their minds, we have a serious problem. So because this topic is never ending and there's a lot of components I didn't mention in this video, I will be making part 2 about what I assume will be the legal system and journalists and all the restrictions, including defamation, some other high court cases, and a bunch of other stuff that relates to free speech in Australia. So stay tuned for that. As always, if you like this video, hit subscribe. If you have a comment for another video idea, something you'd like me to do, something you'd like me to research, please leave me a comment. If something in this video is wrong, like I've said before, I do try to be as accurate as I can, but I'm a human, I do make mistakes. If there is something wrong or you disagree with something, that's cool. Feel free to leave me a comment. Just don't be rude about it. And last but not least, I try to upload on Wednesdays. I should be getting more consistent now that university is finished. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.